Starting in 2022, there's going to be 10 case studies at the end of the CPC exam that need to be coded, so I thought it would be a great idea if we went over some more case studies. So I actually pulled a musculoskeletal case that I have. It is a repair of a fracture so that we can code the Icd-10-Cm and the CPT codes as well. By the way, if you're new here, I'm Victoria. I'm a medical coder, auditor, educator, content creator, speaker, writer, all kinds of stuff in the medical coding field. But what I really want to do is help you be successful in your medical coding career. For this case, you're going to need your Icd-10-Cm book and your CPT book for 2022, because I'm actually just going to go ahead and start 2022. The codes, though, would be the same if you are still using a 2021 book. So we're looking at our surgical operative report. First thing that we have here is our pre-op and post-operative diagnosis, and you can note here that they are both the same. If they are different, we use either the post-operative diagnosis, or if there was a specimen that was sent out for a laboratory analysis, a path report, then we want to code based off of what came back on that path report. For example, if it's a surgical removal of a gallbladder, after that gallbladder is inspected by pathology, they'll give that final diagnosis of was it gallstones or was it just an inflammation of the gallbladder. In this case, we can see our pre-op and post-op are both the same. It says left open both bone forearm fracture. So do you remember what bones we have in our forearm? It's our radius and ulna, and you can see that also documented here, the radius and ulna shaft. So the procedure that's planned and was performed was irrigation and debridement, open reduction, and internal fixation of left radius and ulna shaft. The patient had general anesthesia. The estimated blood loss was minimal, no complications. They had a 4-hour duration. And then we have our indications for procedures. So this is a 42 African-American male presented through the emergency department. His x-rays at that time demonstrated both bone distal forearm fracture that appeared to be very unstable. I discussed the risks and benefits with the procedure, which include the risk of infection, hardware failure, non-union, and need for future surgeries, and post-operative compartment syndrome, carpal tunnel syndrome. He understands the risks involved and consented to proceed with the surgery. Now remember, those are the risks. Those are not diagnoses that the patient has, and we are not going to be coding what the risks are. So if we look at the description of the procedure, I'm going to go a little bit slower with this than I usually do. So the patient moved to the operating table, was placed in supine. Supines when they're laying flat on their back. General anesthesia was induced by the anesthesia team. His left, now we have to circle, I would circle that. We're actually going to circle that here. I'm going to highlight maybe. Left, because we want to pay attention to our laterality. So left upper extremity was prepped and draped in sterile fashion. We placed our attention to the medial shaft fracture over the FCR tendon. So FCR is your flexor carpi radialis. We dissected. So dissected tells us what? If we see a dissection, that means it was an open procedure. They cut the patient open. So we dissected through the subcutaneous tissue and exposed the FCR sheaths. We moved the FCR tendon only, so they have to move the tendons out of the way to get down to the bone so that they can repair that. We detected the radial nerve, so it doesn't say they did anything to the radial nerve. It looks like the nerve was intact because it doesn't state that they repaired the nerve or made note that the nerves were lacerated. So we were able to elevate the FPL. FPL is the flexor pollicis longus off the radial shaft to expose the fracture. So where was the shaft? It was the radial shaft. So we did a radial shaft. So radial shaft to expose the fracture and tried to remove any overlapping tissues and hematoma. We were then able to obtain anatomic reduction, which is consistent with the procedure that they described, open reduction, internal fixation. So the reduction is they're putting the bones back in place with the use of the clamp on the proximal and distal fragment. We placed a 4-hole 3.5 striker plate, so they're using hardware that we're able to incorporate into the radial bow. We then fixed the plate in the 3rd hole distally in neutral mode, and then we fixed the 6th hole in compression fracture. After we were happy with our reduction, so again, reduction, we went ahead and filled the 1.2 and 6.7 screws. So again, they're inserting screws into the patient. We irrigated the wound and closed the incision. Okay. We then flexed the elbow to 90 degrees and turned our attention to the ulna. So this all up here was for our radius shaft fracture. Now we're doing the ulna. We inspected between the FCU and ECU. So the FCU is the flexor carpi ulnaris, and then the ECU is the extensor carpi. We again exposed the fracture site and were able to irrigate and debride the fracture hematoma, so there's some blood clot in there, as well as the new overlapping soft tissue within the fracture site. We reduced, there we go, we're reducing this fracture as well, and used a Stryker 3.57 hole plate for the ulna. In similar fashion, we placed our number 3 hole screw in neutral mode and then used compression technique to place the 5th hole of the 3.5 screw. After adequate fixation, we went ahead and completed our screw fixation. So again, we're fixating it with hardware for the 1.2 and 6.7 hole. We again looked to ensure that fixation on the ulna was also adequate. Then we went ahead and we checked our DRUJ stability. That's the distal radial ulnar joint. And there seemed to be no adequate translation of the ulna at the DRUJ. We then completed our thorough irrigation with cystotubing at the poke hole in the ulnar aspect of the arm. We then closed both radial and ulnar sided with the Vicryl. Wounds were covered with sterile dressings. Dressings were placed. Usually when they're just placing dressings, there's not much else coding-wise to abstract. Patient will remain an inpatient for neurovascular and compartment checks. He will remain non-weight bearing but free to move his wrist and elbow. He'll be discharged upon adequate pain control and will return to the clinic in 2 weeks for a wound check. So I'm just going to add down here our CPT code. Whoops, CPT. Icd-10-Cm. What are we looking at? So I'm going to start with my CPT code. Now, if you've watched some of my other videos, I talk about how oftentimes this procedure performed is a good jumping off point. We don't want to code just based off of this, but it's usually a good jumping off point. And after reading this operative note, it doesn't look like there's anything that was done additionally other than the open reduction and internal fixation of the left radius and the left ulnar shaft. As far as irrigation and debridement, probably more inherent to the procedure. I don't think we would be billing out separately, so I'm not seeing any notations of the depth of the debridement, of the size of the debridement, but let's go back and take a look here. Let me do my Control F, debridement. So it says they debrided, we again expand debride, to irrigate and debride the fracture hematoma. Yeah, so not really anything saying like we debrided musculoskeletal tissue, we debrided tendon. So that to me really looks more like it's inherent to that fracture repair, the ORIF, they call it, the open reduction internal fixation. If you work in ortho or with any providers that do that type of procedure, they will want you to know what an ORIF is, open reduction internal fixation. So let's start with that CPT. We're looking for a CPT for the open reduction internal fixation. Now, some people will go into their CPT book and they'll look in the back index. I prefer to just, since I know it's a surgery on the forearm, to just go into my musculoskeletal and look for fracture repair in that area, which I'll show you how to do. So here's our CPT book, and they order it in most cases from top to bottom, head to toe. So we're going to start with our procedures of the head, and then after that, it'll be procedures of the neck, procedures of the shoulders, and down to your feet. So forearm would probably be after neck, and let's see, neck, back, spine, arms, shoulders, here we go. So if we look under forearm and wrist, right there is our fracture code. And again, I'm using the 2022 book, so that's on page 181. So what kind of treatment are we looking for? Are we looking for an open treatment or a closed treatment? So in this case, we're looking for an open treatment. So here we have open treatment radial shaft fracture. And if we look at our documentation that we have, it is a radius and ulna shaft fracture. So do we need 2 CPT codes or do we have a combined? So closed, that's not it. If you're marking your CPT book, which this one is my new book, I haven't marked anything in it yet, highlighting in different colors or notating different, the open versus closed can help you code a little bit faster when you're picking out those codes. So open treatment, radial shaft includes fixation. I think I saw down here, open treatment of ulnar shaft. And then if we keep going, open treatment of, here we go. Open treatment of radial and ulnar shaft fractures with internal fixation when performed of radius or ulna. Well, this was both. So if you review the documentation here, you can see we did the radius and ulna, but the internal fixation here, it says when performed radius or ulna. So we did internal fixation of the radius or we did internal fixation of the ulna, but we actually did both in this case. We did both. So if we go back to our parent description, open treatment of radius and ulnar shaft fractures with internal fixation when performed, and then there's our semicolon. I'll zoom you in because it's a little hard to see it there. There's our semicolon. So now we go back to read the child code of radius and ulna. So in that case, our CPT code is going to be our 25575. 25575. I'm actually going to verify this in Find a Code. Again, if you're interested in Find a Code, if you want to be able to look up codes as easily as I do and have access to all of this great information like right at the tip of your fingers, use my discount in the video description because you can actually get 10% off if you use my coupon code. So let's take a look at this 25575. And we can see here when we look, this is what I love about Find a Code. Here's my common language description right here. And when I verify this and I read it over, this is what was done in that operative report that we just looked at. And it does mention about how in here it is exposed and clear of debris. So essentially a debridement, they're removing debris. So truly, I think that debridement code would be inclusive of that procedure. So our debridement of a fracture is 11010. If we look at the description of our 11010, it says debridement including removal of foreign material at the site of an open fracture and or open dislocation, excisional debridement, skin and subcutaneous tissue. But that didn't say anything about skin and subcutaneous tissue. It said about removing the hematoma from the fracture site. And even looking at like the lay description, the common language description, it's talking about contaminated foreign material. It's talking about irrigating copiously to remove foreign matter and bacteria. So that really doesn't sound consistent with what was documented, where we're just saying, hey, we just flushed it and irrigated it and removed some hematoma and shifted around some soft tissue. So I feel really good about our 25575. If you wanted to look this up in your CPT index, you could go to radius and then fracture with ulna, open treatment. Probably the opposite way. You could probably go ulna with radius, etc. Now I want to look up my Icd-10-Cm code, so we're going to be looking for a left open fracture of the radius and the ulna. So here is under our F for fracture, and we can see on here our radius is way down here. Radius, and I think on the next column is our shaft. So radius, and then you can see there our radius shaft. And we don't have a specified type. It didn't tell us if it was green stick, oblique, etc. So we would check our S52.30. Here's our S5230. So this is left. So we're going to go with S52302, and we need a 7th character. Our 7th characters are actually on this page here. And 7th character B, so these are all for category S52. Character B is initial encounter for open fracture type 1, 2, or not otherwise specified, and that's what we have. So we have our S52302B, that's for our radius, and actually the ulna I saw was just on the same page above that. So S52202 is our ulna left, so S52202B would be our ulna, S52202. S52202B. Actually, let's take a look and see if we could find them with Find a Code. So ulna fracture, and we go to left, unspecified, it's initial, and we can see here S52202A, so it is getting us to the right kind of section. So S52202, and this would be open. Yep, there we go, S52202B. So Find a Code would have gotten us to the exact same code, maybe even a little faster because we wouldn't have had to flip through the pages. So that's our code for the ulna. So we have our CPT code 25575 for the open reduction internal fixation, and then S52302B for the radius, S52202B for the ulna. I love doing case studies. I don't always have access to a wide variety of specialties though, so if you have something you'd like to send to me, just let me know in the comments and I can get in touch with you. If you're interested in more case studies, here's one you can check out right here. Otherwise, I will see you guys in the next video, and until then, just keep on coding on.